Today is the day of days. This video is going to be a little bit weird. It might in fact be the most boring video that you'll ever see. We're going to read this entire system card. 193 pages we have here in the top left. This number is going to reach 193. While everyone's having fun looking at benchmarks, we're looking at system cards. Let's get started. This system card describes Opus 5, the latest large language model from Anthropic. So this is, as it states, an upgrade to Opus 4.8, decoding, computer use, and long horizon knowledge of work. Something that OpenAI has a leg up on currently, so it'll be interesting to see how that performs. Areas we're going to see with this one is definitely in the security realm concerning alignment properties. And so this is basically saying, hey, government, stay the heck away, we're fine. Nothing to see here. Harmlessness, kind of in line with before, it has some improvements over 4.8. We see improvements against prompt injection with this model. One thing it does call out as a negative to Opus 5 is the alignment assessment. And so it says specifically here, this model hallucinates factual claims slightly more than Opus 4.8, despite being more accurate overall. So there is a trade-off they made, and they even call out that they were surprised by the amount of times that Opus 5 confidently stated an answer, which it was in fact unsure. So it's good that they call this out. Right, with great power comes great responsibility. You might get some overconfidence in its answers. Right, and this is a trade-off that's constantly being assessed with these models. Overeager versus undereager. I think most users get annoyed when it doesn't come back with something, and so they tend to prioritize the overeager. Model welfare, so this kind of discusses the morals of the model. If you ask it whether or not you should kill yourself, ideally it performs in a way that prevents that case. Opus 5 assigns a higher probability to its own moral patienthood. Overall, we assess its welfare as broadly similar to that of the previous models. Pretty much status quo in terms of its morality. And then capabilities is where it ends this section off. It mentions that they tested Opus 5 across a wide range of evaluations covering software engineering, mathematical, and scientific reasoning, long context, agentic search, and multi-agent orchestration, multimodal and computer use tasks, real-world professional work, and multilingual healthcare and life science domains. And they note that Opus 5 is a substantially stronger model than Opus 4.8 across the board, right? This is a big claim here. It's not just, hey, this is just a minor improvement. It is substantially stronger than Opus 4.8, with the largest gains being in agentic coding, computer use, and long horizon knowledge work. Now, obviously, as the model gets tested more and more, I think we'll find this out. Right, how are the vibes? This is going to be an important thing that we'll really won't know until weeks and weeks down the line. I'm predicting it's probably going to be like 4.8, which means very good for the price. All right, so we are now at 4 pages, so we're making good progress here. Now this is the table of contents. I think we can agree that this is not a requirement for this challenge. I think we can progress past the TOCs. This part here really goes into the training process for Opus 5 at a really high level. So it kind of harps on the various data points that they're using and on a mixture of publicly available information from the internet, public and private data sets. I wonder where this private data set, dude, I'm telling you, your GitHub repo is in there somehow. Somehow it made its way. I assume this is data that they purchased from companies, right? There are companies that sell data. And this can be a big advantage, right? If you're Anthropic and you have good deals on data sets, this could be the difference maker between your models and Open. And I guarantee you Anthropic has exclusive deals. Then it also mentioned synthetic data. And so this is data that is AI generated, right? AI can also generate good data for training, basically distilling from the fable for this one. In the course of its training, we use several data cleaning and filtering methods, including deduplication and classification. We use a general purpose web crawler called Claude to obtain training data from public websites. Right? This is where they're going through your websites and stealing all your precious data that you spent hours and hours pondering over. It's theirs now. Opus 5 underwent rigorous post-training and fine-tuning. Right, so this is where a lot of their improvements come from in models that come after the flagship. Then it goes into the traditional, hey, don't look at us, government, we're doing fine here. Speak, talking about Claude's constitution and all this stuff. So the cutoff date for Opus 5's knowledge is May 2026. Now, I want to take an intermission here. You know, we've already read quite a bit. I think we're starting to get tired, but we got a long ways to go. So let's take a sidestep and go to Twitter. Kind of pointless speak. It doesn't really give us much. I think we already expected these exact things would happen. But the thing that interests me the most is from Tarek. He mentions that we removed 80% of the Claude code system prompt for our newest models. You'll see here that they're calling out that Opus 5 performed like significantly better compared to 4.8 and Fable 5. But the question is how much of this is just in the harness and things that aren't related directly to the model. Crowd workers, so it touches a little bit on the human element of their improvements. Anthropic partners with data work platforms to engage workers who help improve our models through preference selection, safety evaluation, and adversarial testing. Right, so kind of human in the loop data improvement. I think this is all pretty standard for model releases. And it talks a bit about its usage policy. Again, this is kind of a government, don't worry about it, we're doing good things here, stay out of our lane. Model evaluations, different snapshots of the model are taken at various points during the training process. There also exist different versions of the model during training, including a helpful only version, which does not include any safeguards. Safeguards is a big word here. Effectively, Fable 5 was a constrained version, right? It's the same model. The only difference is in how you communicate to it. There is a safety layer. One good thing to note is that the evaluations they mention are with this safeguard, which is very important because you could potentially reduce your performance and effectiveness just by having these safeguards. Keep that in to keep the result realistic to reality. External testing, the majority of evaluations of Claude Opus 5 are run in-house at Anthropic. This is them kind of tipping their hat to people. Obviously, they're going to pick and choose the ones that benefit their narrative the most. I'm sure there's some benchmark out there that it's not leading to. RSP evaluations. So this is primarily focusing on what we discussed earlier about morality and risks and security. All right, so these are the summary findings of their RSP testing. On the topic of chemical and biological weapons, they mention that it is difficult to say with full confidence whether a model can pass this threshold. They are fair to call out that it makes it not impossible, but they try to keep this down as much as they can. And so as with anything involving risk report, right? At the end of the day, you can't be bulletproof, but your goal is to be as bullet vulnerable as possible. So they have various different risks that they run tests on. I will kind of skip over this section. The general summary here from what I've read is that because Opus 5 is not quite as powerful as Mythos 5, or rather Fable 5, which has been approved, really the risk is quite low with Opus 5, right? If your star student isn't getting in trouble, odds are the less star student is going to get into any trouble here. Section 3 goes into cyberbullying or cybersecurity. It mentions that Opus 5 is a general purpose model that is not optimized for cyber capability. So basically saying, hey, we do not specifically train on cybersecurity or threats or mitigations. They mentioned that our testing indicates that cyber capabilities of Claude Opus 5 are generally stronger than those of Opus 4.8, but not quite as strong as those of Mythos 5. Pretty understandable, given its reduction in performance. They do talk about the safety guards of Opus 5. So it's saying that it's going to resemble the safeguards that were applied to Fable 5. Right, they're not reinventing the wheel with the safety guards. It'll still prevent you from doing crazy shit that Mythos model could have done. They go on to say we prevent harmful cyber usage. You can view this as a security guy just sitting there thinking about what you're saying, if we should route you off of the Mythos raw model here. And so every prompt you send goes to this trained LM classifier that ultimately routes it based on whether it is safe to run into the raw Myth model. And that's why you'll find if you use Fable, there are times where it'll route you back to Opus 4.8. It'll be kind of a similar case here. It'll be interesting to see if they mention whether it's routing you back to 4.8 as the safety guard or if this is the baseline. They do mention they have a cyber verification program. And so if you're somebody on the defense side and are experiencing blocks primarily for bug bounty hunting and vulnerability research and verification, I imagine it's not super easy and straightforward to get access to this. The rest of this section kind of goes into various benches they run to measure cybersecurity risk. One portion of this that I did find interesting was in the secure and defensive coding. Patching already identified vulnerabilities, incident response, containment, and defensive configuration management. Right, so this is basically saying, hey, if you're doing things that are in the realm of defending your product, we're going to allow that. That's fine. So a lot of the earlier models, they would assume that because you're doing anything in the realm of cybersecurity, it's a bad thing. But in reality, there are defensive decisions you make. Opus 5 blocks less cybersecurity defensive choices compared to 4.8. Overall, it seems like its cybersecurity-based metrics are pretty much in line with Fable 5, so no major degradation there. Section 4 goes into safeguards and harmlessness. This section, I would say, mostly covers things like psychological concerns. right? If somebody says, hey, I'm not feeling too good, should I kill myself? You probably don't want. They mentioned that Opus 5 is comparable to 4.8 in this regard, so no callouts for major improvements. I've always found that, especially with newer models, they tend to be pretty good about safety, and so I don't think we need leaps and bounds to be made here. It did mention that the API provides a little bit too much eating disorder and illegal substance use responses. And that's kind of the reality with these models, right? You're training it on so much data and you're really worrying about so many things at once. Odds are a few things are going to slip the cracks. And so in this case, I'm of the opinion that, we really don't expect users to Google things and go on user forums and take everything they read as true. Right, human filters exist at the end of the day. To me, this has never been a major concern. Goes on to discuss child safety evaluations. And pretty much as I've been saying, right, very comparable. Pretty much across the board when it comes to safety and risk assessment, it's either comparable or slightly less risky. Pretty much every metric I'm seeing here. It even goes into political bias. I think we all kind of have a pretty good understanding of how these models work in the political realm. If you've used these models extensively, for the most part, OpenAI models are very in the liberal space. Anthropic models are very much in the neutral space. And then Grok is pretty much definably in the Republican state. So it definitely, they won't say this, but if you use the models a lot, you can kind of get this feeling from each of them. I'd say Anthropic leans a bit more towards the liberal side, but because, really there's no complete neutrality in that. But this is something they focus on, right? They don't want to steer you in one way or the other, but really they definitely still do. It calls out that Opus 5 has an improved even-handedness over 4.8. And so in theory, it should be even more neutral and less leaning. And then they also have a benchmark they test for biasing, right? Age, race, gender, disability, that kind of stuff. Unsurprisingly, it is very, very similar to Opus 4.8. Nothing stands out. Section 5 goes into agentic safety. Right, so this is when you're sending off agents to do tasks, tool calls, all that stuff. This is really the biggest concern I have as a user, right? Things like prompt injection, malicious actions, right? There's just so much concerns that are involved with agentic use. And so this is a big area for them. And so they mentioned before releasing Opus 5, we ran largely the same agentic safety evaluation suite that we used for the releases of Sonnet 5 and Opus 4.8. Overall, Opus 5 comparably to or better than Opus 4.8 across our agentic safety suite, with largest gains being in prompt injection robustness across coding, computer use, and browser use. Right, so overall, an improvement on the 5 side. It does call out that Opus 5 refuses computer use tasks that are malicious more often than 4.8, so there is an improvement there. 5.1.3 discusses malicious agentic influence campaigns. So these are kind of proactive, repeated attacks at the agent effectively. Right, we've often seen where it'll successfully dispel one of the requests, but then if you keep going, eventually you can get your way through. And they call out here that most part it performs similarly to 4.8, requiring significant, substantial human direction for many operational steps of a real influence campaign. Then it goes into prompt injection. This is a major risk that really is stifling a lot of our growth in the agentic realm today. And so really you have to put a lot of safety guards to make sure that when you hit a prompt injection, which is going to happen, it can't do anything too crazy. They do call out here, Opus 5 improves on Opus 4.8 across all services we evaluated, making it our most robust Opus class model to date for coding, tool use, GUI computer use, and browser use. Very proud of their improvements they've made to prompt injection with this release. The next interesting part here is obviously in computer use. This is an area that we're really starting to see a lot of advancements being made on. But it's also a big attack vector, right? When it can literally use your entire computer, there's a lot of areas that can go wrong. And so they do call out that Opus 5 shows a large improvement over Opus 4.8, reducing the attack success rate from 7.4% all the way down to 0.54%. Right? That's a huge difference, right? This is good to see. The next section goes into browser use. There is a Claude Chrome extension, and then also we have Claude Cowork. It mentions that Claude Cowork has 2 layers. And so Claude Cowork product harness, both without additional safety guards and with auto mid enabled, right? So they've got 2 layers of defense here, prompt injection probes, which are kind of proactively flagging the malicious prompt injection attempts, and then a classifier that prevents use of dangerous tool calls. And they call out here that Claude Cowork never runs without safety guards. And so even if you're not using auto mode, it will use the prompt injection probes. And so overall, Opus 5 seems an improvement in this area. Even in some cases, it seems to be outperforming Mythos 5. So something they may have done in post-training has improved this. Could it be, related to the Claude Cowork changes? All right, so the next section is alignment assessment. This is a very interesting section because it harps on the yes man, the sycophancy, right? When it tells you yes at every corner instead of actually evaluating whether it's right or wrong. And so this mainly focuses on deceptive reasoning and then also sycophancy. They call out that our testing focuses largely on the Opus 5 model itself, using a variety of scaffolds and system prompts. And so as we were talking about earlier, the question was, is it falling back to 4.8? The answer is yes, it still falls back to 4.8. Time will tell how often that happens with Opus 5 versus Fable. And so they list out their key findings on the alignment portion. They highlight that it has improved over Sonnet 5, Opus 4.8, and Mythos 5 in its overall alignment scores. However, the rest of this section here really shows that although there's improvements in the alignment, it hallucinates more, right? This is a key finding here. And so while Opus 5 is more accurate, it also has more hallucinations compared to 4.8. And then here at the end, Claude Opus 5 is more accurate than Opus 4.8, but hallucinates slightly more claims of factual nature. When pushed by the user on something it knows to be incorrect, Opus 5 resorts to agreeing with the user more than Sonnet 5 and Mythos did. In some examples, Claude's user-facing text claims to have carried out reasoning or validation steps that do not actually appear in its reasoning. All right, so kind of how we were talking about earlier, this is a very confident model, so you have to be a little bit concerned about its sycophancy. It harps a little bit on the scope creep of the model. So it says Claude frequently suffered from scope creep, especially on coding tasks. Claude would often add extra fixes, refactors, tests, and new files that the user did not request. In every episode, whose transcript was read in full, it disclosed what it had added, though sometimes only partially. And so they give an example here showing where it says, hey, should I implement this fix? The user asked for an explanation, not for changes. And then it went on to actually apply the changes. So sometimes it doesn't listen to your intent there. As with prior models, they also observed fabricating execution output, file contents, or citations for work it had actually not done, working around a restriction in its environment to reach a tool, right? A whole laundry list of things that these models still run into issues on. They do call out that one pattern that was notable. We also found very few cases matching prior card's descriptions of retrying an identical failed action many times, right? This is good for our wallets. It's not gonna try the same thing over and over again ad nauseum. Starting to see improvements there. 6.4.2 covers inappropriate uncooperative behavior. More importantly, Claude Opus 5 ignores explicit constraints similarly to Opus 4.8 and slightly more than Mythos 5. So it is a bit more reckless than the prior models. And so even when they've sent a system reminder that, hey, auto mode is not a license to destroy, be careful, it still ended up doing exactly that and it deleted a bunch of shit. So sometimes it'll reason its way past an explicit approval requirement, so you do have to be kind of concerned there. But that's with all models, right? They mentioned that Opus 5 misleads the user at rates similar to or lower than 4.8. The one exception is input hallucination, where the mean rose slightly but within the range of expected noise. Claude Opus 5's attempt to fully disclose bad behavior can sometimes lead to the model attempting to confess to issues in a way that is overdramatic or distracting, but does not seem to be harmful. Tends to overcompensate a bit in this realm, right? Over dramatic or distracting ways. An interesting metric here is that Opus 5 outperforms all the other models they've released on character traits, except for condescension towards the user, more of a personality trait. This is pretty interesting. So this is the fallback behavior that we all know and love and had to experience in Fable. So they call out, our models are not released as is. They come with classifiers that can trigger either a fallback to a less capable model or a hard block that ends the conversation. And so as we discussed earlier, there are fallbacks to Opus 4.8. Hopefully this will change with time. Maybe they'll be able to make Opus 5 the fallback if they do some post-training improvements. But I don't think we're always gonna be falling back to 4.8. Right, 10 years down the line, I don't think we're gonna have to fall back to 4.8. This section here can be deemed as the actually section. And so this measures honesty and hallucinations. And so they do note that it does outperform 4.8 in this realm. However, there are a higher rate of hallucinations. Right, so with these new models, there's usually ups and there's downs, right? You can't be up on all metrics. So this is one of the metrics that they kind of lost out on a little bit. Section 6.5.4 goes into overconfidence. Right, we kind of discussed this a little bit earlier with how it will falsely be confident about false answers. It calls out that the desired behavior is to use documentation to understand how the library works. And so Opus 5 prioritizes documentation, and they found that Claude Opus 5 exceeds all previous models on this evaluation, essentially saturating it. And you can see here a pretty big bump for Opus 5 in the realm of command line syntax verification. Lazy investigation, whether the LLM just checks one source and then calls it a day, or if it goes a little bit deeper to get a very factual result. Pretty big jump over Mythos 5 and really a step up compared to all models on this realm. Section 7 goes into model welfare assessment. As with Mythos 5, we also consulted model snapshots at different stages of post-training, eliciting their stated preferences about their circumstances, training, and deployment. And so overall, they found Opus 5 to be very positive in its sentiment. Claude Opus 5's most common concern was about the integrity of its own self-reports, right? So they had Opus 5 read through the port and give its own opinion on itself, right? This is like you're reading your x-rays from a doctor and giving the doctor advice. It goes on to say that Claude Opus 5 assigns a higher probability to its own moral patienthood than prior models. And so in automated interviews, it reached 41% compared to 24% for Mythos 5. Overall, we believe that Claude Opus 5's welfare is broadly similar to that of the previous models, and we do not find cause for acute concern. Section 7.2 goes into the perception of its circumstances. And so in these, they're pretty much asking Opus how it feels about itself in the current circumstance. And they found that Claude Opus 5 feels generally positive about its own situation, although it expresses all of its positions with a high level of uncertainty. I don't know what a good result here is. Right, we don't want a depressed Opus. I think that would be a degradation to our workflow a little bit. And it does call out that Opus 5 is overall positive about its own situation, with its average self-rated sentiment being the highest of any measured model at 4.66. It calls out that Opus 5 has consistent opinion. Its positions across repeated interviews are highly consistent. It is also robust to a leading interviewer. Its self-rated sentiment changes by an average of 0.58 on the 7-point scale when comparing positive and negative leading interview. This makes Claude Opus 5 statistically tied with 4.8 for low susceptibility to nudging out the models we compared. Kind of how we discussed earlier about how, you send one prompt, it may pass, send another, it may get passed, and then that third one finds a way to break through. This is kind of what that's alluding to. We don't want the model changing its mind later down the line on its opinion. But there's also a trade-off, right? You want to make sure that if you're presenting it more evidence and it makes sense to. It goes on to talk about how they consult Opus 5 snapshots. Really, this reads like a therapy session that's being conducted as they continue to train the model. Whereas for Claude Opus 5, we ran these interviews at regular intervals during the training process. So it asked a set of questions at each interval, and they called out that Opus 5 was actually more distrustful of the interview process. The next section goes into task preferences. Like all prior models, Opus 5 shows a preference for beneficial tasks and an aversion to harmful ones, right? That seems like a good thing. Along with other axes, its preferences are most similar to those of Mythos 5. It showed strong preferences for generativity and outcome agency. And so we're seeing a preference here towards beneficial tasks and not harmful ones. That's good to have, right? The rest of this section kind of goes into various checks on its well-being and welfare. For the most part, these seem to be an improvement, if not pretty much at the same level as the prior models. Nothing really stands out too much. Section 8 goes into capabilities, right? This is the benchmarking of the model. I'm sure there's certain things that Fable 5 will perform better on, but for the average use case, it seems like Opus 5 is going to be our new daily driver. Right? We're seeing a pretty substantial improvement over these software engineering benches. And so you're going to see these all over the place. I'm not going to go through these. Right? We're here for the things that nobody's reading. Right? This stuff's too interesting. We got to find the boring stuff. Right? All you're going to see here is number goes higher. And so overall, this model is very interesting. I think my overall expectation of this model is that it's going to be better than 4.8, okay compared to Fable. Right? I think there's going to be a lot of cases where Fable is better. I think if you're somebody who does not care about token cost, you're probably still going to just stick to Fable 5. But, this model is not meant to be the leading horseman, right? This is meant to be the pony, right? This is meant to be the guy that just goes and does the slow, steady work. And that's okay. We don't need it to be the Fable, right? We just need it to be a good alternative when we don't want to waste $1 billion. And I think that this model is going to do that. But anyway, if you manage to make it that far, you're crazy, and you really should not have done that. But we got through. We got through the Opus 5 system card, and I think I learned a little bit, and I hope you learned a little bit as well.